Well, friends, I want to begin by, as I mentioned at the notices, by taking a little pause from our sermon series about the Nicene Creed. We'll come back to that next week. But I want to take a pause today to tell you about two very broken, two very imperfect, and on the surface, two very seemingly useless men called Peter and Paul. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, so these guys we're talking about today, they aren't very special. Why are they in the Bible? Why have we heard from both of them today, or about both of them? We had Paul with his letter to Timothy, and we had the story of Peter being freed from prison in the book of Acts. So why are we devoting a whole day in the church's calendar and a whole chunk of the Bible, particularly of Paul's letters, to these two broken, imperfect men? And, I mean, it's not just including them in the Bible. Like I mentioned, the church sets aside a whole Sunday, well, it actually was Thursday, but we've just moved it to this Sunday, to remember these two saints. And they actually, they're so special within our church that I have to change the vestments and change the frontal to red because it is a day where we remember the martyrs of the church, those who were killed for their faith, of which Peter and Paul were. The red symbolises the blood of the martyrs. I mean, where else can you go where the person leading whatever it is wearing red because of the blood of the martyrs? It's an interesting thing we do, this Christianity. I love it. So, there's two martyrs we're celebrating today, but their martyrdom is part of what makes them special, their death for their faith, but hundreds of thousands, millions of people have died for the Christian faith. So that's not just the biggest part of it, but these two saints tell us what God likes to work with, or who God likes to work with. And God prefers to work with broken people. He doesn't like to work with perfect people. Because here's the thing, friends, God is perfect. God's perfect. And you are not. And I am not. I say that, when I say you, I mean me as well. God is perfect. We are not. Kim is not perfect. God doesn't even have to pretend he's perfect. You know, he doesn't have to put on a persona to show the world that he looks perfect, because he is perfect. We can just accept that. God is perfect, the end. So what can he do with perfect people, you know? Well, not much. Primarily because they don't exist. But certainly we do like to pretend sometimes that we are perfect. But I want to let you know, friends, a prerequisite for God to use you for the goodness of his kingdom and the saints is that we have to allow ourselves to be cracked open a little bit. And that's tough. It's not an easy thing to do. But we have to allow ourselves to be cracked open a little bit. Last week at Sunday night at our contemporary service, I spoke about the process of surrender to God. But what do I mean by surrender? How do we allow God into our brokenness? That's really what surrender is, allowing God to be in our brokenness. Well, the good news for you is, and for me, is that we've got two examples from Scripture this week, Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul. Now, Peter and Paul gave up everything to follow Jesus, and they eventually gave up their lives. And Paul speaks of his impending demise in that Timothy reading today. I am being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. I hope I can say that when I come to die too, because Paul was sitting in prison reflecting on his impending death at the hands of Nero. Not Nero. Peter was at the hands of Nero, but Paul was also at the hands of the Roman authorities as well. So the emperors don't like people like Peter and Paul back in the day because they challenge their power. Because Peter and Paul weren't afraid to be bold for Jesus, and the emperors of the time weren't real thrilled with that because they were the gods of the time. So when you've got these two guys coming along and saying, actually, there's only one God and Jesus Christ is his son, they start to get a bit cranky. Now, Peter was a scapegoat of the Emperor Nero, and he put the blame of the Great Fire of Rome onto the Christian population. So there's a couple of huge fires in Rome, but there was a particularly big one that Nero blamed the Christian population for. So they were scapegoated. And Peter, not feeling that he was worthy enough to die like his master Jesus, he said, I want to die for Jesus. And if you're going to crucify me, then you are crucify me upside down, because I am not worthy to die in the same way as Jesus. So if you see an upside down cross, if you come out to St. Peter's Bendolba this afternoon, you'll see an upside down cross in the window. It symbolises St. Peter because he was crucified upside down. So both men surrendered, didn't they? Paul was beheaded, by the way, that's how he died. So he was surrendered to his fate, and so was Peter. It's as if they said, Jesus, whatever it takes, whatever comes my way, I will follow you, and I will do it even if it costs me my life. Now, we've spoken a little of something called vulnerability in the past, but if you can't remember the definition of vulnerability, one of my favourite authors, some of you are already thinking you know who it is, and you would be right, Brené Brown. She defines vulnerability like this. She says, the definition of vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, but vulnerability is not weakness, it's our most accurate measure of courage. So vulnerability is not weakness, it is our most accurate measure of courage. That's pretty big. Vulnerability is actually strength. And did you know that St. Paul predates Brené Brown by a few centuries, right? So he's been around for a while. And he says the same thing in 2 Corinthians 10. He says, for the sake of Christ then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions and calamities, for when I am weak, then I am strong. So Brené and St. Paul, have both got that in common. Vulnerability is courage. Now, here's something to blow your mind that only exists in Christianity. That the times that we are strongest is when we are at our lowest moments. Isn't that bizarre? What a bizarre paradox. In our world that tells us that it's the other way around, Christianity says, no, when you are at your lowest, you are at your strongest. When people are weak, when they submit to God, he can take over and use his full strength. When someone is at their weakest, then they are most dependent on God. And that's the model Peter and Paul give us. They are vulnerable. I mean, they go to their deaths in a pretty awful way, but they are also bold. Now, let me let you in on a little secret. When you surrender, friends, to God, something weird happens. I mean, God works in a lot of mysterious ways, and he's always doing something weird behind the scenes. But certainly, a thing that happens when we surrender, the fear that keeps us from living boldly about the faith, it actually disappears, because you surrender some of this control and some of this pride that we have, that we can control the situation ourselves. Now, I know this from 2 really reliable sources. The first one is the Bible, very reliable source, and the second one is my own experience. So we've all got experience, and we've all got a Bible. If you don't, let me know. But we've got those 2 really reliable things. So let's start with the Bible first. So the gospel we heard this morning, where Peter is asked 3 times if he loves Jesus, prefigures or shows us something before something else that's really important. It shows a huge change in Peter from a meek disciple. If you remember at the crucifixion scene, he denies Jesus 3 times, into a man who declares boldly, yes, Lord, I love you. And did you notice that it's 3 times Jesus asks, Simon, do you love me? And can you remember where that question is? Where Peter is questioned 3 times about Jesus, somewhere else in the gospel? He was asked 3 times, do you know that man that's being crucified? And he says no 3 times. It's the 3 denials of Peter. So here we see Jesus giving Peter another crack at the questions, really, isn't he? It's a second chance. And it's actually been, some people have called this moment between Peter and Jesus the sacrament of second chances. Isn't that a beautiful line? The sacrament of second chances. There's always second chances with God. It's never over. You have always got a second chance with God. We are never written off after our mistakes. If St. Peter has a window in our church, you will not be written off for your mistakes by God, right? So Peter is vulnerable enough to own the faith for himself. His fear disappears. He spends his time in prison converting his jailer all through the book of Acts, the very people who are trying to persecute him. And I mean, if that's not disappearing fear, then, I don't know what is. And likewise, we see in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, which is the letter we're preaching through it Sunday night, but later in that letter, Paul tells us about himself. And this is a paraphrase here. He says, "You know my pedigree. I was of a legitimate birth. I was circumcised on the 8th day. I'm an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a strict and devout adherent to God's law, a fiery defender of the purity of my religion, even to the point of persecuting the church." So he actually says, that's a paraphrase, but he says in the original that he's a Pharisee among Pharisees. So he was the top Pharisee, right? This guy had it made. He had the perfect job. He was so well educated. It paid well, I'm sure, but he was well respected among his colleagues. He wore the right clothes. He knew the right people. And then something happens on the road to Damascus. Something changes for him. He's hunting Christians. He's on his way to Damascus to bring the Christians back to Jerusalem to have them killed. And he's on orders from the high priest. Go to Damascus, get those people who are following the way, which is what they used to call Christianity, and bring them back here to be executed. And then his life was turned upside down when Jesus appeared to him on the road and said, "Why are you persecuting my church?" And Paul becomes the greatest evangelist the world has ever known. Now, I'll never forget a time when God moved in my heart the way he moved in Peter and Paul's, and perhaps how he's moving in yours as well. I remember a sermon by my friend Liz. You've all heard about Liz. Some of you have met her. And it was at St. Peter's, East Maitland, probably on St. Peter and Paul Day. And she was talking about what one needs to give up for the faith. So she had a bit of a story about giving up some things. And I was a pretty new Christian at the time, and I had a really overwhelming urge to follow Jesus. And I remember praying, a pretty dangerous prayer, mind you, because it's a prayer of surrender. "Lord, you tell me what it is you want me to leave behind to follow you, and I will do that." And that's a very bold prayer. Very dangerous, because all sorts of things happen because you let God work. Now, a year later after that, my mother died, and then my father died a couple of years after that. And I wound up going, "Are you serious, God? Are you serious? I have to, give up this?" Now, don't get me wrong, God doesn't make people die, but he does use situations for his glory. And after I worked out over many coffees with my spiritual director that God was indeed calling me to be a priest, and him using me to surrender to the process, my spiritual director said, "Kim, you've got to surrender. Lay down the pride. God is trying to tell you something." And I remember praying another dangerous prayer. I was in bed one night, drifting off to sleep. I said, "Righto, God, you tell me where I'm going and I'll go." And here we are. Dungog was the answer, which I didn't know at the time. But you tell me where I'm going and I will go. So it was after giving up my job, my whole life, I gave up something more than that. I gave up my pride. I gave up my fear of being vulnerable. We've got to be vulnerable with God so he can use us. See, with pride and fear in the way, God can't work because we're pretending to be perfect. And we're not. We're made in God's perfect image, but we don't make the best choices at times. It's okay. That's why we're here. I think the point is this, friends. God loves us because we are broken. Because we are broken. Not in spite of it. It's because of it. And it's almost as if, you've ever been to someone's house and it's a little messy. If you've ever been to the rectory for growth group, you will find that. And you're super grateful they don't clean it up for you. You've ever done that? You've gone to someone's house and you go, "I'm glad you left it messy," because it's a great compliment. You're a person that they feel safe to be around, and you end up loving them more because they're authentic. They're real. They're not pretending anymore. They're just letting you see their life as it is. And it's a bit like that with God, really. We have to be prepared to allow God to love us because of our mistakes, because of our sin, because of our frailty, because of our brokenness. So if I can leave you with this week, friends, like St. Peter and St. Paul, you and I are not perfect, and we don't have to pretend to be. Okay, we can let that go. We can lay that down at the cross. We are not perfect. I want to challenge you to look at each other this week and love each other because you are not perfect. Because you are not perfect, because you are broken, because you have let down your guard and chosen to be vulnerable, to let God in and to surrender to him. Because, friends, when we do this, we are following in the footsteps of St. Peter and St. Paul. Amen.